All right, so believe it or not, the government, in theory, creates a budget every year. Technically, it's every 2 years. They have to. But every year they have to create a budget to say this is how much money we're going to spend. They have to pass it into law. It has to get passed into law, which again means that the Senate and the House have to vote for it, and the President has to sign it. All right? Back in, let's see, when was the last? Who's the last person who closed the government? Was it Clinton?
Yeah,
Or did the Bushes do it too? Okay, yeah, that's right. So the last time we had the government closure because we couldn't pass a budget with Clinton. And what happened after Clinton was the Republican Party got back in control of the Congress, and they passed a new law that created what's called the continuing resolution, which if you heard anything about the shutdown, government shutdown about a month ago, they kept talking about a clean CR, right? I mean, we will talk a little bit about what they mean by that CR, continuing resolution, all right? But in theory, the government's supposed to pass a budget every year. First off, the government's budget is from October to October, not calendar year, all right? So if you see any businesses whose calendar year is not the same as their budget year, this is why, because the government goes from October 1st to October 1st. Well, I guess whatever, to September 30th or whatever. All right, so normally this is when the government has to start passing its budget is by October 1st. That's why it closes down in October more often than not. Right, so the 3 government shutdowns have happened in October over our history. There's been some 4 to 5 hour shutdowns prior to the Reagan era when Reagan closed down the government, but the real longest ones haven't happened, started happening in the 80s and 90s and 2000s and whatnot. All right, so in theory, the budget process for the budget. It's a 3 or 4 step process depending on how you look at it. I like to consider it a 4-step process, but whatever. Some books will say it's 3, some books will say it's 4. So the first step in it's November and December. The initial budget is created by the OMB, which technically, in case you don't know what that stands for, Office of Management and Budget. This is supposed to be a nonpartisan committee that is created to set up the budget. Of course, the Office of the Management and Budget is appointed by the President, who is supposed to, when he appoints people to the Office of Management Budget, appoint people who are nonpartisan. Guess how often that happens? Again, I will leave it up to your imagination as to whether you believe the nonpartisan Office of Management and Budget is really nonpartisan. It's supposed to be. The people who are on top of the Office of Management Budget are almost never nonpartisan folks. They are partisan people who have donated to the appropriate political party that was elected. But the people who are underneath and actually work inside of the Office of Management Budget, those people literally are nonpartisan. They're like you and me, folks. I mean, theoretically, I am nonpartisan when I'm up here teaching, or I try to be as much as I possibly can. You can debate amongst yourself as to whether or not that really is. All right, so normally this goes between November and December. Again, it kind of depends on how long of a break the government gives itself at the end of every year. Right, so normally the Congress meets in October and then takes a Christmas break, which is basically all of November and December. because they work really hard. Yeah, they took a three-week break, came back and worked for a week and a half, and now they're on 2-month break for Christmas and Thanksgiving. They come back to work sometime mid-January. Yeah, sign me up for that difficult task. Anyways, the idea is that then the second stage, which is these two tend to run together. These are the two that some people say are really the same stage or the same step, is that the president takes whatever the Office of Management and Budget creates as the budget. In theory, the president can amend it before it goes to Congress. Usually doesn't. Again, because most often the people who are at the top level of the OMB are his cronies anyways. So, yeah. So usually they don't. And, of course, it wastes even more time. Because, of course, the real big step is step 3. Budget goes to the CBO. And again, CBO, you got to learn some acronyms, folks. These acronyms will get thrown out at you all the time. Yes, this is the Congressional Budget Office. Again, the CBO is, in theory, a nonpartisan committee, and that's, of course, because it's a committee made up of both Republicans and Democrats in Congress or in the Senate. All right, there is a CBO at the congressional level and at the Senate level. They both debate changes that they want to make to the budget. All right? Now, this is where most of the, this is, like February to in theory, August/September. So the CBO sits down, and what's supposed to happen is that the people on the congressional budget offices, they go through line by line of the budget and say, okay, the Federal Agricultural Committee gets $2.5 trillion, and inside of that $2.5 trillion, here's where all this money is going to get divided up into different committees, groups, and grants. And it's the CBO that goes on a line-by-line basis and decides whether or not any of those lines are good. All right, so the CBO has the right to remove any line from the budget that they wish. They can also add to any line of the budget a rider. Pork, that's exactly the right word. They basically take pigs and attach them to different lines in the budget. Normally what happens is that the CBO is not supposed to add more money to the budget. They always do. All right? But the most that they can add is somewhere between 15 and 25%. I don't know what the real figure is because I keep seeing numbers that are bigger than I thought possible. There has to be something, because otherwise some of them would go nuts, right? I mean, there's a guy in the Congressional Budget Office from Montana who has been putting on riders for grazing on the budget every year for 20 years, and he's still on the Congressional Budget Office. I can't remember who the guy's name is right now, but he's a Republican congressman from Montana. Actually, a very intelligent guy, which is nice, but unfortunately, he knows who butters his bread, and he makes sure that they get funded for it. All right, so whether it's a research grant for grazing or it's straight up funding for it, payments directly to them practically. But Congressional Budget Office is supposed to take it on a base, on a 2 to 3 month basis, and once they are done with it, step 4, send to President to sign. And if the president doesn't sign the budget, what does he do with it? Kicks it back to step 3, right? If not happy, repeat step 3. So this is where the president and Congress have a little bit of a bitch fest. How many years has it been? I think the government hasn't had a budget for 6 straight years. since 2007, 2008. Yeah, been continuing resolution since then. But this is what's supposed to happen every year. And again, right, I mean, our forefathers were relatively intelligent in that they said the government cannot spend any money until this law is passed, in theory, right? Unfortunately, we have not had this law passed in 6 years, so how the hell does it work? Well, we got smart in outsmarting our forefathers back in the 90s when we had another government shutdown and Congress said, look, the president is not going to hold Congress, for ransom again, ever, right? I mean, that's what they were trying to say was being done by Clinton back in the 90s, and technically even Reagan in the 80s, was that the president was holding Congress, over the fire, saying, if you guys don't pass my budget the way I want it, I'm going to shut the government down through you, right? Again. Well, I don't think they locked them in, but they had a mandatory government or presidential meeting at like 11 p.m. or something like that, and so they all had to stay. Well, that was the powers that be that forced them to stay. It was the Senate leader and the Republican majority leaders that made them stay at the time. Yeah, true. Okay, so what happens if the law never passes? Well, technically it's supposed to be government shutdown. And again, this is what Reagan and Clinton and even Bush to some degree used to their advantage to try and get Congress to do the budget things that they want, that presidents wanted. Again, it's one of those where the executive, legislative powers battling each other throughout history in our country as to which one's more powerful. It's tough. It's a tough call sometimes. All right, but in the 80s/90s, and honestly I can't remember what year it was that they passed this continuing resolution law. A law was passed called the Continuing Resolution. And the Continuing Resolution, the reason why it was passed was that it really wasn't the Congress or the Senate that was complaining. What it was were all of the different federal budgetary committees and conferences that depend on government money and funding that were complaining about the fact that when the government doesn't pass its budget soon enough, they can't budget for their own fiscal year without knowing how much money they're going to have. Right? So imagine, if you will, that you work for the U.S. Treasury. And every year the government has to say, U.S. Treasury, you're going to get, $1.3 trillion to spend, and here's where all the spending is going to be. And you're sitting in your office as a middle manager at the Treasury going, well, I would love to tell you whether or not I can pay you next week, but I don't know. And so normally, when you're looking at your budget numbers as a company and you see that you don't have enough money to pay payroll, what do? You panic and you start firing people. You have to lay people off. Because if you don't have enough money to pay for them when they come into work, you could ask them nicely, well, would you mind coming into work and donating your salary to the U.S. government? How many of you would work if you were told that you had to come in and work and donate all the money that you made from that day back to the company that you were working for? Yeah, I don't know if I would. Nothing personal to you guys, but I probably wouldn't show up. All right, so basically the idea behind this is that this law states that all essential government offices can assume equal funding from year to year if no budget is passed. And so actually what's been going on for the past 6 years is that the government every year has used this law to fund all of the essential branches of government, like the military, fire protection, the Homeland Security, the FAA, all the things that make sure we all don't die. All of those things get money every year through continuing resolution. Every other branch of government has to petition the government to pass mini laws that create 1 year's worth of spending for them every year in order to get funding from year to year. So if you're on the education committee and you want to get so much money for, the National Science Foundation, in order to get money, you have to literally send a lobbyist to Congress. That lobbyist has to continually pester certain members of Congress for however many days it requires until that particular member of Congress takes your petition to the Congress and says, we want to pass, $10 billion for the NSF for research in education next year. And it has to get passed into law as a single one-line item budget process and go through the whole process. Everybody has to do this. Imagine all of the different levels of government that are quote-unquote non-essential having to do this every year for 6 straight years. Utterly ridiculous, okay? This is asinine. It's just pathetic. Again, this is potentially my disgust at the level of ineptitude in our current Congress showing through here a little bit. But this is literally how we've been forced to act as a government. Instead of acting as a group of people, we have to act as little mini individuals that are only caring about their own little agenda, and that's it. And so there's no give and take anymore, at least right now in the current setup of the Congress. Honestly, I almost think that they should abolish the continuing resolution and force them to sit down and actually pass a budget. But yeah, it's ugly, folks. But anyways, I would like you to know the steps that we're supposed to go through to get a budget, right? So start with the Office of Management and Budget, go back to the president who sends it to the Congressional Budget Office, and that particular Congressional Budget Office is supposed to sit down and add, subtract, remove different pieces. And the other cool or not so cool thing, depending on how you look at it, is that when the president gets the budget right now, the president has no way of removing anything that the Congressional Budget Office adds. So if there's a rider on a particular line item, like suppose that in the FDA, there's a line item that states the government must spend $200 million on cattle research as to whether or not, human growth hormone is a negative impact on cattle. If that is added to the FDA's budget, the president has no way of removing it from the budget at all. He has to kill the entire budget process in order to get that particular one line item removed, or send it back to Congress and say, look, guys, I'm not going to ever sign a law that says $200 billion go to cattle research on human growth hormone. We know that human growth hormones in cattle is bad. Quit paying for it. Guess what we've done every year for the past 5 years? We keep studying it. Yay! Yeah, very true, very true. They've been pushing for it. And again, it's one of those where, I guarantee you it would never happen now. The only time it would ever happen is if the three levels, the three branches are all the same, yeah. So you'd have to have Democrat, 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 or Republican, Republican, Republican in order for any of those to pass. And then, of course, they would pass it with a whole bunch of caveats that would make only their particular veto cares the things that could be vetoed. Really? Okay. All right, so this is the budget process. This is how it's really worked over the last 5 years. It's all, that's the only way we've spent any money legally in the last 6 years without having little back office deals to create one-line budget items for different pieces and branches of the government. Good or bad, it is. All right, so this is how it works. Now, I try really hard to give this with a very non-judgmental tone, and I just can't do it. I mean, I agree that being a senator or a congressman would be a very difficult job. I agree that it's a difficult job. But, you know, there are days when I come in here and it's really difficult for me to teach, yet I'm here doing it every day, and, you know, hopefully I'm doing at least a half-decent job. And, you know, I don't tell you guys to go home for 3 straight weeks and say, learn on your own, good luck. All right, so where does the money come from? Where do you think it comes from? You would like to think that the government spends money by collecting taxes, right? Right? We would like to think government pays by pulling out tax payments. Again? Morgan, could you close the door for me, please? Thanks. Do they always vacuum during my class? I mean, have you ever... Ah. Okay. Ah, well, again. And again, it wouldn't surprise me if these ceiling tiles are not healthy for breathing materials that fall off of them. Again, I don't know what the materials are, because, again, if it was a bad material, we couldn't say that it was, because then it would be bad. Right? Have you guys ever dealt with a house where you may have had asbestos tiles and you're not sure, and so you don't test them so that you can't report that you know, but yeah, exactly. We don't know if this paint is lead or not, and as long as you don't know, then it's okay to not report it. But once you do know, then you have to report it. So instead of the law, which is supposed to make it so that everybody knows what's going on, everybody is willfully ignorant of what's going on, so they don't have to pay for it. Well, it is. Oh, man. Okay. Unfortunately, or fortunately, again, depending how you look at things, unfortunately, the government pays for almost everything by selling debt. It used to be that there was one account that the Treasury ran that was basically money for the government, and that what the government would do is it would say, oh, whenever I need to pay a bill every day, it would go into this account and pull out however much money it needed and would spend it. And if there wasn't enough money, then the government would sell some Treasury bills or Treasury notes to refill that account and then spend the money. That's like 1980s, 1990s type of mentality. Nowadays, folks, the accounts are actually separated. There is one account where money goes into the government, and there's another account where the money goes out. And there is always enough money in that account for going out to pay at least 6 weeks worth of government bills at all times. That's why when the government shuts down, they always say that, well, we've got about 4 to 6 weeks worth of time before we can't pay our bills, because we've always got a 4 to 6 week buffer set up by selling debt already that will just then trickle down as we go slowly into debt further. All right? So realize that they're separate things, and always it's through selling debt, right? So all government expenditures now come from IOUs. USS. Treasury bonds, notes, or certificates. Treasury bonds, this is debt that the government sells that is 10 years or older. Treasury notes are government debt that's between 1 year and 10 years worth of debt, and certificates are things that are less than 1 year's worth of debt. Right? It used to be that when you wanted to buy government debt, you walked to your bank and you told the teller, I want to buy a U.S. savings bond for my brother's new son, so that he gets $100 when he turns 21. Right? The classic, here's your U.S. savings bond because you were born. Right? And normally it's a $100 savings bond. You give them like $70, $60, depending on what the interest rates are, and then that $60 or $70 will grow to 100 in 21 years. Of course, it's more like 70 or 80 now because interest rates are almost non-existent. But it's all done through IOUs. So please, whenever we ask how the government pays for itself, don't say it comes from taxes. Right? About the only thing taxes are used for now is to pay off debt that's coming in. Right? So when you cash in a treasury note, a treasury bond, or a treasury security, or you collect interest, that's when the tax money comes out. Right? So it's paying for the debt. That's where most of our money comes through. Now, supposedly, and I can't go, they take the money from the tax collections account and move it into the tax paying account. But I don't know that happens because I've never seen the bank report showing it. Okay? It just makes things easier for the government if they have two separate accounts and that there's always enough money to pay every bill that they ever need to pay. If you're told, I don't know how it works for you guys, but that's what my parents always told me, is that you should have 3 months worth of salary sitting in a savings account that you can use just in case there's an emergency, right? So you get sick so much so that you can't work for 3 months. You need to have that 3-month buffer somewhere so that you can pay it down, right? And that's essentially what the government's doing. They're just doing it at levels that are grossly larger than what you and I would do. Yeah, they got about 3 weeks worth of money sitting inside of here. And that's also because they've gotten a little bit better at predicting how much they have to spend, which is one good thing. Right? Used to be they didn't know. Now they've actually got statisticians keeping track, which is cool. Or mathematicians. Great stuff. Okay, so homework question number 1. Find our national debt as of October 1st, 2013. Do not use a site that ends in .com or .biz or .edu. It must be .gov, and I recommend treasurydirect.gov. That is one of the best true real debt reporting agencies out there, folks. I got a friend who actually works for the Treasury, and this is what he does. He updates treasurydirect.gov. Yeah, the debt clock? No, the debt clock is that's a scam. Yeah, that's Fox News. Yeah, that probably says 25 trillion right now. Would be my guess. All right, so my question to you is, who has the right to buy this government debt? Do we only sell it to the Chinese? Do we only sell it to the Iraq? Well, they do have some of our debt, folks. Every country in the world who has a monetary system has invested in the U.S. government at least somewhat. All right? Everyone, did you see the number? That's one of the best numbers ever, right? I always use that in my math business apps class because then my students have to deal with trillions, which is, that's 12 zeros. That's great stuff. Put that in your calculator. Come on. Have fun. Well, all right, so this includes U.S. citizens, foreign citizens, I guess they're citizens of another country, U.S. or foreign companies. Please realize that companies spend a great deal of money on our debt as well. Apple owns about somewhere between $10 and $20 billion worth of U.S. debt as well. I mean, this is part of their, equity is built up into U.S. debt, right? Obviously, also foreign countries do as well. And U.S. government agencies. We sell our debt to ourselves. State of Wisconsin owns a good, $200-300 million worth of U.S. national debt. And the city of Madison, the city of Janesville, I guarantee each one of them has a good $10 to $20 million worth of U.S. debt as well. They need it because it's equity. It's equity so that if they don't collect enough taxes in order to be able to pay for their budgets, they can sell that U.S. debt in order to have enough cash to pay their bills. Same type of concept. But the problem here is that the national government is selling debt to the local government, which is collecting interest on the debt from the national government. And of course, then the local government has to collect its taxes from us to pay for the... It's hard when the right hand has to pay the left hand interest. I mean, how do you pay yourself interest? This is why oftentimes people consider the U.S. government's debt situation a Ponzi scheme, because we are selling ourselves debt that we have to pay ourselves back 30 years from now with interest on top of it, and we pay that interest by borrowing more money from ourselves to pay ourselves the interest 30 years from now. It's a great math trick. And it works. All right? Now, this better lead to homework question number 2. So, well, not quite to it yet, but net public debt, all right? This is the portion of our national debt that is not owed to ourself. In other words, non-governmental agencies. Non-governmental agencies. If I could spell agency. So that number is at least a little bit nicer when you look it up in U.S. Treasury Direct. So homework question number 2. Find out how much of our debt is real, right? I.e., owed to someone who will demand that we pay it back. You and I, in theory, when we buy U.S. government debt, we wouldn't demand that the U.S. pay us back if it ran out of money, in theory. Because we as citizens would want to support our national government, and in order for us to properly support it, we may make donations to it by not collecting on a treasury bond or treasury note that we're due interest from. Of course, that's probably baloney too, but the idea is that that's why we keep track of this number, all right? So find out what our net public debt is on top of it. This might as well take us right to number 3. So if we know debt, that's how much we owe. How much did we make? What do we call how much finished products are produced in a year? GDP. Find U.S. GDP for 2013 calendar year. Calendar or fiscal year, either one. So if you want to find GDP from January 1 to January 1, that's cool. Or if you find it from October 1 to October 1, whatever. Just find a year's worth of what GDP is for the U.S., at least last year. And what are we going to do with that? Compare our debt to GDP. And do it in any way that you feel comfortable doing it, right? If you know anything about debt-to-equity ratio, you could talk about debt-to-equity ratios or PE ratios if you've taken any business classes at that level. Or if you just want to subtract the two and say that, we owe more than a year's worth of our production, or we owe less than a year's worth of our production, that's cool too. If you would like to calculate percentage, that would be awesome. Percentages are always good. All right, so as you can tell, there's not going to be any homework from the book this week, or at least today. It's all just going to be look up on the web. And again, please look on a government website. GDP may take a little bit of work to find on a government website. It's not as easy to find as you might think it would be. Treasury Direct, great one for debt, but GDP, we know everything on the internet is true, just it might be only true for like a second. And that second may have been like either... All right, so let's see. Do I need to go to the next one, or should we just wait? So since we have all of this debt, what do you have to do when you borrow money? You have to pay it back and find out what our interest payment was in 2013. So remember, 2013 for the fiscal government is October 1 to October 1, right? So their 2013 fiscal year is actually over. So you should be able to find out how much interest we paid in 2013. And if you want, you could even tell me what the average interest rate is. And to do that, all you have to do is take the interest and divide by the debt. That's it, just in case you wanted to do that. That would be cool. The other thing that's going on, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not afraid of all the debt that we have, is that what is the interest rate that the government is charging right now? If you buy a 10-year Treasury note right now, how much interest will they pay you? Anybody know off the top of their head, roughly? 10-year Treasury note right now, folks, 4%. That's cheap. Back in the 1980s, 1990s, late 80s, all the way through the 80s and early 90s, Treasury notes were being sold at an interest rate of 16%. 30-year Treasury notes, right? It's 2013, right? So 1983, that's 30 years ago. The Treasury notes that the U.S. government was selling to people were paying 16 to 18% interest. think about making that much in interest right now. You'd crap yourself. I would. Have a few times this week, damn it. Those Treasury notes are dying, right? The interest that we're paying on our debt is actually dropping, even though our debt is growing. The reason why? We're selling all of our new debt at 4%, and all the stuff that's finishing up right now, 16 to 18 flipping percent. All right. By the year 2020, right? So the government doesn't sell Treasury bonds longer than 30 years, right? The longest one are 30 years, and you could get those 30-year bonds at literally 15 to 20%. Those are all ending because they stopped selling them at that rate around 1990. They all started dropping down to single digits, like only 9 to 10%. So that's why right now, as we extra dollars per year, we actually pay less in interest. Because the interest rate that we're paying the money at is double digits less, percentage-wise. Who'd have thunk it? At this stage, folks, the money is almost free. I mean, the government should just crank it out. Who cares, right? At 4%, come on. What's going to happen when interest rates go back up to 7 and 8%? That's when the government's going to be hurting folks, right? That's when it'll be back to trouble time, okay? So from that perspective, the interest rates, are they scary? Yeah, but again, our interest payments are not going up, so doesn't bother me too much. And folks, I'm a mathematician. You would think me as a mathematician and knowing what compound interest does to you, we would be freaking out. And I'm like, not me. So, when I first started teaching this class 5 years ago here at Blackhawk, I asked my students, do you guys know what the debt ceiling is? Everyone in the class did this. Every single one of them. I was like, they thought a debt ceiling meant that the ceiling in the room was going to come down. Well, they just never heard of it, right? Because we'd never had an argument about the debt ceiling prior to 2008, 2009, 2010. They didn't know. We'd never heard it bitched about, right? How many of you know what the debt ceiling is now? After the last 3 years. I mean, you could be a rat in a hole and you'd still know what a frickin' debt ceiling is, right? Because we've been talking about it nonstop. Yes, this is the legal limit to our national debt. It is national debt. A lot of people have wanted to change the definition of the debt ceiling from being national debt to being net public debt instead. So in other words, quit worrying about all the money that we owe ourselves and only worry about the money that we owe other people. That argument has not gone very far, especially with the Tea Party floating around at the current time. But that's been a push recently. Oh, you need one more. Let's go since, how about 1950? How many times has the debt ceiling changed since 1950? Here's another one for your noodle. How many years has the debt ceiling changed more than once? And the answer is not 0. In 1 year, the debt ceiling has changed more than once, at least 2 or 3 times. All this whining and crying about the debt ceiling, folks, it has been changing since the day it was first created. So while it's a very nice law, it's the biggest joke that's ever existed. Although it is a law, and therefore we have to abide by it and follow it, and therefore whenever we get close to the debt ceiling, in theory, we have to pass a new law that says, let's erase the old number and put a new one down. And, at this stage, they've had to change paper about 4 or 5 times, because when you erase the same page more than like 6 or 7 times, the paper rips, even if it's really nice paper. And they use vellum, right? The really nice, thick U.S. paper. Well, government only buys new, too. Come on, you know that. So it's good, thick, bonded paper. That's used. Come on. Oh. All right, so that's the last one. This is it. That's enough. I love this question, though. I always ask my online students this one, too. It always makes them freak out. Because, of course, everybody thinks, the debt's like, it changed like, 5 times, maybe 6? Yeah, right. All right, so it is a law. It does exist, but whatever. All right, so here's the $64 million question. No, I'll answer this one for you. Well, I'd love to hear your opinion, but I have to cede your opinion first. Because, of course, most of us are going to say debt is scary, and it's bad, right? Because if you're in big, huge amounts of debt, you have to pay it off, right? So, from one perspective, let's look at it from the first perspective, the easy perspective first. Let's look at yes. Yes, it is scary. We have to pay it off. And the accumulated interest is, let's see, how about we'll just call it unwholesome. Now, these are the terms that we use to describe the emotional explanation for why debt is bad. I mean, have I given you any actual real numbers for any of this stuff? No. This is a very, very, very nominative argument, folks. There's no facts going on in this at all. I haven't told you, anything about paying it off in a yearly installment or anything like that, blah, blah, blah. There's no numbers whatsoever. So when people tell you that the debt is something that your children are going to have to pay for, they are trying to pull your heartstrings. That's their job. They're trying to make you fear government debt, right? And so they want you to say yes to this question. Again, since you have done Chapter 2 in this class, when you had the difference between nominative and positive arguments, you should immediately stop and say, look, you are not giving me any solid information. You're just trying to tell me you should be scared. Fear is a very, very, very powerful tool, folks. Everybody uses it. I use it, right? Every day I come into class, what's your biggest fear that I get to throw over you? Fail, right? I mean, you guys have to do what I say or you're going to fail, right? And in theory, that's the reason that you keep coming back here. I mean, I would like the real reason that you come back here is because you paid for this class and you'd like to get something for your money. That's what I'd really like you to do, but I understand that that's not actually how it works. Or that would be my argument for why it doesn't work, right? That I am God, and what I say goes. Sorry. It's nice to pretend every now and then. Anyways, the real argument that economists use for why debt is not about having to pay it off. Economists could give a crap about paying it off. What economists are afraid of is that the debt is all of a sudden stopping us from being able to get more debt. That's what economists worry about. The real economic reason is that if we go far enough into debt, people will quit lending us money. If we are, quote unquote, too far in debt, people, companies countries will not buy our IOUs. That's what happened in Greece and Spain and Italy. Those governments got so far in debt that the rest of the world looked at them and said, wait, you want us to lend you $1 million and you're already $7 billion in debt and your GDP every year is only $1 billion? I don't think I trust you. Therefore, I'm not going to bother to buy your debt. So what does Greece and Italy and France have to do in order to get people to buy their debt? Well, what do you get when you lend money to the U.S. government? And what does the government pay you when you lend them money? They pay you interest on your IOUs, right? So if no one will buy our debt at 4%, what does the U.S. government have to do? They have to raise it to 5%. And if people will quit buying it at 5%, what do we have to do? Raise it to 6%. And once we get up at the 10 or 11% range, folks, then what do companies and people start doing when they say, ooh, you're going to pay 10% on that debt? Are you really going to pay 10% on that debt? Can you afford to pay 10% on that debt? Then you quit getting people to lend you money. That's the real economic reason, right? So here, this is Paul Ryan's argument. The first time I heard him argue about us going into further debt, I was wowed. Because I honestly thought that he was a pompous pig when I first heard about him, because I didn't know who he was. And he was just, sort of a Southern Wisconsin Republican, and I was like, well, he's probably, enough said. But he came in and had a talk, and the talk was brilliant, right? He came in and said, look, the U.S. government is going further and further into debt. Yes, our interest rates are lower, but eventually people are going to get scared of the debt level that we have, and they're not going to buy our debt at 4% anymore. They're going to demand 5%, they're going to demand 6%, they're going to demand 7%. And once interest rates start rising, then the whole shit hits the fan. Because now our payments, right? Because if you pay 10% interest, you have to pay more to finance the debt, which means that you're going to have to go into more debt to pay off the debt. Yeah, we get screwed. And that is still a very real fear that exists for economists who have enough brains in their head to know what's wrong with heavy levels of debt. Unfortunately, the American people don't seem to think that that's a real fear, because have you heard a politician say that in the last 5 years? I haven't heard Paul Ryan say it in 4 years. Bastard. I was like, wow, maybe I would vote for him. I almost was thinking about it too. Not anymore. Because the argument went back to, your debt's killing your babies and blah, 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 blah. You're going to have to sell your child to China in order to work or whatever. It's like, that's just straight fear-mongering. Paul Ryan's argument is the more debt we generate, the more interest rates will rise. When interest rates rise, do we invest in companies when we see big, huge interest rates at the bank? No, we don't. Investing in companies is scary, folks, because they're not guaranteed. Investing in banks, that's backed by the government. Investing in the U.S. government, technically it's backed by the government as well, since the government backs itself, hopefully. Anyways, though, the idea here is that these interest rates rise. What happens to investment? It falls, and so does GDP. Paul Ryan gave an 8-minute talk on how this happens, and he was eloquent and intelligent and used graphs and pictures, and I was like, wow. I was like, woohoo! And it didn't even have any color. I was like, wow, he really must believe in this stuff, right? Because the only time you ever use a graph that doesn't have any color is when you actually understand what it's saying. I mean, listen to anybody who talks about a graph that has color, and they'll be talking about the color. And in the red section, you will see the real problem. And if they have to call it the red section, they don't know what it is. Okay, that maybe that's a little bit of a me-ism, but anyways. This is the real reason that people are nervous about government debt. And this is a great argument. If you want to argue about why debt is a problem, this is it. Because at some stage, at some point, the U.S. government's going to have to start paying more interest in order to get more debt. And when that happens, that's when the shit starts hitting the fan. And it's going to smell bad in this country. Because we will turn into Greece and Italy and Spain. Because when the government can't go into any more debt, it has to cut spending. And when the government cuts spending, when G goes down, what happens to aggregate demand? Goes down with it. What happens when aggregate demand goes down? Bye-bye GDP, hello recession, depression, nastiness. Okay? That's just the way it's going to be, right? Greece has been in a recession for 4 solid years. Not 4 quarters, 4 years. And they're still not out of it. And no one really sees a future out of it yet. That, in theory, could be us. That is a real fear. And it's factual and economical. As opposed to, babies dying in the street because we can't pay our interest. Okay? This is the real argument that should be used. And I love it whenever I hear this from any sort of fiscal conservative person because it's a real solid, great argument. All right? Now, people who do not worry about the interest rates, who do not worry about this, why is the debt not a problem? Their argument is that if you boost government spending now, what does that do? This will spur aggregate demand. When aggregate demand grows, what happens? Growth in aggregate demand leads to growth in GDP. When GDP grows and the government and the country starts getting out of recessions, what do? People are getting hired more, we're paying less unemployment, we're paying less welfare, we're paying less Social Security, we're collecting more taxes. What happens to the borrowing needs of the government? It lessens and lessens and potentially and hopefully, and actually does every now and then, disappears and we can pay off the debt. Happened in the 90s for 3 years, well, 2 years. Clinton had budget surpluses, he paid down the debt. $500 billion. That was the last time we paid off any of our debt was the Clinton era. But that was because we actually followed this rule. The problem with most of what we've been doing lately is anytime we get out of a recession, instead of taking our budget surpluses and spending it on debt, we've been spending it on war. Whatever. War is good too. It's the same as getting rid of debt. Well, if you take over a country, right, I mean, that's going to add to your GDP production, right? And that's what we did, right? We took over, like, Kuwait and Iraq and Afghanistan, right? They're like the 51st and 52nd and 53rd state, right?
Yeah, that's what happened.
All right, anyways, folks, this argument that Paul Ryan gave, which is why I went to the talk, is because he titled the talk The Crowding Out Effect, which is actually a classic economic argument for what's wrong with debt. Right? It's the crowding out effect. It crowds out investment and leads us into a state where we can't borrow anymore. And again, the argument to that, this is the counter argument to it, right? This is what's known as a Keynesian argument. The Keynesian argument to the monetarist, right? Did I say that this was monetarists? Sorry, I didn't at the beginning, did I? Now, I doubt Paul Ryan would actually agree that he's a monetarist, but sorry, I should have said that at the very beginning. This is the monetarist's argument. This is the Keynesian argument. Monetarists don't. They believe in the crowding out effect because it's going to raise interest rates and mean we can't borrow any more money. Keynesians say, no, 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 no. If we borrow, we can spur aggregate demand by spending, and when we spur aggregate demand by spending, that growth in GDP that comes from it will come back to us in taxes, and we can pay off the debt after we're done. And, again, if it takes 3 years of spending to get it back, who cares, right? Because once we come back, we will come back strong, and it will last for a long time, and we'll just pay it all the way back down when we're done. Well, we haven't come all the way back yet, right? So we're still waiting. So if we just keep spending for 5 or 6 or 8 more years, then once those 8 or years are done, then we'll...
We might have a budget by then.
Yeah, right. Don't. The budget...
I wish I could run my house on no budget. Because we have to spend.
You can. You can. You just keep going deeper into debt. You just keep taking out another credit card. That's what we did all the way through the 90s. Right? That's what the people did, right? Yeah, we did. Right? I mean, that's what the 20s and 30-somethings in the 80s and 90s did, right? I mean, unfortunately, we weren't 20s at the time, darn it. Yeah. True. We were just a little bit older. We could have had 8 credit cards, and all of them were maxed out, and we could have been, Yeah, exactly. We would just get a new one to not have to pay the old one, and you just keep cycling them through. That's exactly what the government's doing. Yeah. Just keep trying until you get one that's got enough. It's all good. All right. Anyways, that's chapter 17, folks. Again, 6 questions that I asked you about. Look those up. Please use a .gov in place. Okay? And if you just want to print the website, that's fine too, and then circle the number. That's cool. Please make sure, though, GDP, do not give it to me as a percentage increase or decrease from last year. I want a hard, solid number, okay? What I've gotten the last couple of semesters in this class is people telling me that GDP is 0.2%. Yes, GDP has gone up 0.2% this quarter compared to last quarter. I want a number, okay? So, tell me it's 15 trillion or it's 10 trillion or it's 28 trillion, whatever. Give me a solid number. If you have to, you can go that way. Yes. Joe, turn me off if you could. Thanks.